Hello everybody, Saturday 4th of July 2020 for les rencontres économiques d'Aix-en-Seine from the Maison de la Radio in Paris, 11:30 sharp. Nicolas, DOZE, economic journalist at BFM Business. The topic is regulating the power of monopolies, and we've already received some interesting questions from those who have anticipated the debate. I will talk with my guests. Yifan Ding from the University of Foreign Languages in Beijing, who will be in a video conference with us from Beijing. Stéphane, PALLEZ, president of the Française des Jeux. Olivier PERONNET, who is also on video, director of the audit cabinet, the Finexsi. Sébastien SORIANO here at the Maison de la Radio, the president of ARCEP. George TERRIER, who's the lawyer at the Paris bar. And the debate is coordinated by a member of the Cercle des économistes. I'd like to introduce Anne Perrault. Hello, Anne. And so you can introduce this first debate on the regulation of the power of monopolies. And then each of the guests will have about 4 minutes each to tell us how they see this topic. And then we'll have a Q&A session. We'll take some internet questions, and we hope to have a lot of questions from the auditors. So, Anne, bit of historical background. In the past, I don't know if everything was better, but everything was simpler. The sectors that had strong fixed costs and growing returns, electricity, railroads, were more efficiently operated by monopolies. For example, they avoided the duplication of a railroad infrastructure, would have been very costly. And this market structure encouraged behaviors that would not be favorable for the consumers, whether in terms of quality or price. So the doctrine was that either these companies had to be public monopolies, or these activities, or under the close control of the state, or private concerns regulated by the states, which impose a form of behavior. So this has not disappeared. With the more classical networks, technological progresses or developments have establish a better sharing of regulation on what could be open to competition, like the railroad services. The infrastructure is a regulated monopoly. The access is regulated, but today we think that the diversity of transport services can be better served by competition with a competing environment. What can make things more complicated is the newcomers that are the large digital platforms, often in a state of monopoly or in a very dominating situation. They're not heirs of a legal monopoly, but they're highly concentrated due to the network effects, which explain their large size, and they share some characteristics with the former monopolies. That is the marginal cost, what it costs to serve one user or one additional or offer one extra transaction. The marginal costs are very low, and this forces a concentration, but this gives rise to regulatory issues that are new and on which it's difficult to adapt solutions inherited from the railroad or electricity. So one question that rises is, should we regulate or prescribe to say what the platforms can and cannot do? That's what we talk about when we talk about regulations. Or do we say that the right of competition, the law on competition, should these policies be enough to try to curb abusive behaviors, detect them, and sanction them eventually? So the question is, how should we imagine the regulation for these new economic actors? How does the privatization of the private monopoly should be imagined in the present context? Should the right to competition, is it enough or not? Should we regulate the digital platform, but with tools under which hands? Should it be a new regulator involved? How can we imagine drafting or writing what is authorized and what is forbidden? with a view to their very opaque way of functioning. And finally, the monopolies made up by the digital platform are entities on which all interactions interact between the private life, for example, social right. Should all the employees be salaried workers, like the Uber drivers, for example? This also has an impact on competition and what these platforms can do. So the minute you change one thing, everything just changes. Well, that's the new challenge. So thank you, Anne Perrault. In a few seconds, she really gave the gist of the debate. So there are historical monopolies where the right to compete has been well imagined, but the new platforms are very inventive and they give rise to the need for new solutions. Yifan from the University of Foreign Languages in Beijing, you have 4 minutes to share with us your vision on the issue of monopolies. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be able to share my analysis on this topic. In my opinion on the topic, how we can regulate today's monopolies. But I think we have to establish a distinction between 3 types of monopolies. The first monopoly is cultural. Second monopoly is a kind of a state support, and the third monopoly is today's monopoly, that is a kind of state support plus the technological control. So the first kind of monopoly, the natural monopoly, not the cultural, natural. So it's a natural trend when you do business. Just think of the crossing of the Boston River in the 19th century to realize of the benefits that the monopoly can yield. The Standard Oil, for example, is another example, Standard Oil, because the monopoly is a natural form of business enabling the investors to earn a lot of money and have a guaranteed income. So the state intervention is enough when you're faced with such a monopoly. For this reason, that all the countries invented their own antitrust laws. So it's easy to put an end to the first form of monopolies, negative impacts. The second form of monopoly is more complicated. It's a kind of monopoly that's supported by the state. Just think of the model of the German enterprise after the creation of the German Empire. And the words that were used to define these large corporations were invented by the Germans, i.e. the cartels, for example, the syndicates or consortiums. So they all these forms of commercial entities with the aim of exercising a monopoly. The third kind of monopoly is a bit more complicated. It's the monopoly of the Americans on the production of semiconductor and other technologies, telecom technologies. So this is an abuse of the legal tool that they call, I didn't hear that, I'm sorry. We noted that sometimes the American legal system arrest they stop people who are involved in the telecom or semiconductor industry. And it's not by hazard that that if a book published in France has become a bestseller because it tells the story of a manager from Alstom who was trapped by this American system to enable GE, General Electric, to lay its hand on Alstom. It's this French story inspired the Chinese because it reminds us of the Malinois Cho decree. A CFO, it's a CFO. The CFO, it's the financial manager of the Huawei company. And so I'm sorry, Yifan, we don't have much time. So I'm at the end of my speech here. In fact, the Americans never hesitate to forbid the selling of any semiconductor material to Huawei and to all European or Japanese companies who would want to use the American technology and would be willing to sell this technology to Huawei. But this gives rise to a lot of problems because, first of all, it will force American companies not to respect the commercial contracts. And this will force other companies, European, Japanese, or other, to avoid signing contracts with American-based technologies. But in the short run, we can't solve this kind of monopoly. But this kind of monopoly creates a lot of disorders on the international markets. I'm wondering if the Europeans and the Chinese should do something to break this form of monopoly that is not regulated as of today. Thank you. Thank you very much, Yifan, and congratulations for the quality of your French, which is impressive. So I hand over the floor. So you raised this struggle between China and the U.S. with Americans that you consider as in contradiction with the principles of the market of commercial contracts and negative collateral effects, even for the American companies themselves. Stéphane PALLEZ, the president of Française des Jeux. You have 4 minutes to share with us your vision on the subject which regulates the monopolies. So thank you very much.
So let me start by reminding you that a monopoly is not a bad thing per se. It is a form of organization that has its reasons and its advantages. But the idea is not necessarily to have a monopoly, but to avoid excesses and abuses. So I think we all agree on this. Now, from my standpoint, what's striking is that we have monopolies that we can call former or classical monopolies, such as natural monopolies, like Française des Jeux, founded on the idea that it is a mode of organization that some state can choose to avoid some risks, and we are able to regulate them. Now, you might wonder whether they are well or badly regulated, but the functionings are identified. And in France, the evolution means that the state is less invested in those companies, and we have regulations and regulation tools, which was the case for us because we became privatized. So this is something quite well known with well-known tools. Now, what has happened before is the emergence, well, more than the emergence, the power of the monopoly that came from the digital revolution that were seen very positively from the outset because people said, well, this is innovation. But they're turning into the bad guys because people are saying they're endangering consumers or other companies or even the states because they are so powerful that they cannot disappear any longer, contrary to the current theory of monopolies. So the question is, what kind of regulations for such monopolies? And we don't have the tools so far. The second point is that the cumulation of both monopolies, the fact that some of them are regulated and legitimately so, because I believe monopolies must be regulated. So the fact that the regulations are rather strict for national monopolies and these very powerful players who are not regulated creates some sort of a confusion and very concrete problems. I have a game regulators that approves of the game I put on the market, but I can have Apple or Google telling me, no, I'm going to withdraw this app from my platform. So there's some sort of a disproportion and tension for the companies which are regulated. And that's a problem, which leads us to say that we must think about how to regulate in our current world so as to ensure innovation and competition and maybe other objective. And this is my third point. Today, we think a lot about monopolies or competition, but Anne Perrot said that there are many other reasons to regulate monopolies, and those reasons interact. That is protecting personal data, which is interacting with competition. And there are new motivations that are not only economic motivations, because monopoly have a power that goes beyond the economy. So it will be needed. We will have to find tools at different levels. And I'll stop here because I think it's the end of my time. Yes, Anne was talking about social reasons or protection of data. Among the questions I received, there's also the question of taxation. Maybe this enlarges the subject too much, but we can see that this is a very complex subject. Olivier PERRONNET from the audit company of Finexsi. The floor is yours. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be with you today. I'd like to shed an economic and historical light on the emergence because we're talking a lot about GAFAs, and I'd also like to think about several prospects that go beyond the economy. You've already said that somehow. The GAFA model, which is very variable from one company to the other, is something we've never known before, and it's globalized. So we are dealing with companies that invest considerable money at the beginning, and then became global groups, and they are in deep competition with one another, because when they appeared, they started from a concept that was the leader takes it all. So the idea was to take all the market. Now, if we consider investment and losses of these companies with powerful investors, in fact, in Europe, and because we are less focused on startups, we saw companies that were incredible mushrooms and that took a very important position. However, all the models are not identical. And Perrot said earlier that some profits are marginal, but if you look at Amazon, it's an enormous logistical platform. And if we look at mass distribution, this is similar in Amazon with huge warehouses. But in terms of capacity for development, they were very, very quick, much quicker than any others. And so we are somehow mesmerized because what they said, the winner takes it all, actually occurred. They are part of the first 10 listed companies, and they are very powerful. And some of them disrupt many social phenomena, such as the social networks. Social networks are above union when it comes to social movements. Elections are disrupted by the social network. Now, that's for society, but concerning economy, the older world has been shaken, and the capacity for competition to emerge has not appeared. So, facing the leaders of the takes-it-all policy, we need to find competition, but it's going to be complex because to have a globalized vision of a startup today is very difficult. There's only the United States and China that have this globalized vision, and it would be an emergency for Europe to have their startups grow. Thank you, Olivier PERRONNET. Let me just finish Okay, digitalization is probably the best answer, but also regulation. And maybe there are other specialists to talk about the subject. Now, Sébastien Soriano, you have 4 minutes, and then we'll finish with Georges Terrier. Hello. I'm a little sorry because I will contradict many of the things you said, but this is the principle of a debate, isn't it? The question of how to regulate monopolies means that we've lost already because we're accepting that they are monopolies. And I believe that the first reaction we should have facing a monopoly is to break it. I think this needs to be very clear. But it's when there's an abuse in monopoly that we should break it. Let me explain myself. So I'd like to refer to the quotation of the Senator Sherman. If we refuse that a king governs our country, we cannot accept that a king governs our production, our transport, or our sellings. So what does it mean to regulate a monopoly? It's shifting from one power to another. Because if a main private company has power, well, they will share power with regulation. But it's just a shift in powers. And there's a democratic danger that would be an alliance of the state power with the main companies, which led to the Snowden case, which in China led to a surveillance model. So we have to come back to competition because it is democracy in the market. So we need counterpowers, and the ultimate arbitrator will be the consumer. So I think we should absolutely keep on having this ambition. And in the last years, the authorities of competition were influenced by economists' analysis with very nice equations, but they tended to drift us away from the essential, because we believe that monopolies should be accepted and we should live with them. What I'm saying is no, we have to break monopolies. Through what? Innovation, investment? You're interrupting me. Let me speak. We have to go back to the core of liberalism. Louis Brandes, who was one of the fathers of the right to competition, was a liberal. In the 50s and the 60s in the USA, there was a right to competition that allowed innovations in the Silicon Valley. And it is thanks to this right to competition that the Silicon Valley was created. So at one point, we were really liberals and benefited from the powers in the market. In some cases, it is meaningless. The case of Française des Jeux is a good example, because if we break monopolies, it would mean money laundering and people playing without control. But those are exceptions, and the rule should be competition is a vibrant and lively democracy. So if you do not do this, it is serious. Otherwise, the model of market democracy will be attacked. Because politically, we feel that many things might happen. And if we're not consistent with ourselves, and if we do not confront, as we did with the telecom 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we had a French monopolies of electricity, and now there's competition. Otherwise, we will endanger the competition.
Quite audacious or bold, because you're questioning the function is yours. You're saying that the regulator can be a democratic risk, and that the solution is in competition, and the good counterpower is that of the consumer. Georges Terrier, to conclude this roundtable, that would lead us straight to 12. You're a lawyer at the Paris Bar and member of Davis Polk and Wardwell Cabinet. George, the floor is yours for 4 minutes. Thank you. We'll react on what SORIANO just said on the question of definition of monopoly. We talk a lot about a monopoly, but the regulated monopoly and the non-regulated monopoly needs to be broken and fought against. But the notion of monopoly does not affect the situation of domination. It's the problem of the GAFAs. The GAFA, it's not the problem of the control of the market of the internet. It's something else. The problem of GAFAs is the power, this power to have access to the market, this kind of the gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers actually apprehend all activities. And Stéphane PALLEZ mentioned this for the Française. The Jeux, if you want to develop an activity, maintain an activity, if you want to survive, often you have to use a platform, whatever the goods and services. You have to propose to the clients applications or apps that are iPhone or Android. You have to make publicity on Google. So consequently, the GAFAs are a determining player and extremely sensitive on the functioning of the market that goes well beyond the notion of relevant market in the sense of competition laws, the definition of goods and services in for a geographic zone. So this is a change in paradigm on the functioning of the market and difficulties to apprehend all these kinds of dominations, because the GAFAs, as we saw, they're vampirized. They're vampires, leaders. We take over startups. We take their innovations. We pump their innovations. So upstream the market, you know, they act as vampires, and so there's a concentration that obviously is justified. And Olivier PERONNET reminded us by the weight of institutions and the loss that were added. So it's in this. We have to apprehend this whole problematic. So the question on how we should apprehend them, how we break them, or we regulate them, well, we're faced with some things that these actors are global, transnational, and they fit in the phenomena of globalization. So it means two things essentially in terms of the capacity to regulate and to eventually punish, is to find the right jurisdiction, to find a way to attack them eventually. And this is a key difficulty. If you want to break a monopoly, go back on this ambition. If you want to break these monopolies, or this monopoly which is fluctuating, changing, and it can't be identified as such, because at the same time it's upstream the concentration of the market players, and downstream insofar as they exercise their power in the setting of prices and so on and so forth. And there we're faced with a problem of the policies on competition, economic policies, and we are forced to see that, to accept that the competent authorities, or at least there are three, in fact. There's the World Trade Organization at the international level, even though it only deals with commercial laws of IP and this World Trade Organization, I think we'll go over this again, is not necessarily dead, but it's nevertheless blocked for several reasons. We'll go back on that. And with geopolitical stakes like China and the United States, which are very important, the United States that have did not replace the judge of the Court of Appeal of the World Trade Organization. Then you have the community authorities that have who have intervened in two sectors: the abuse of a dominating position. They're pretty good at that level. And the problem of controlling concentrations, and there they're not dynamic enough to curb the restructurations that are unfavorable to the consumers and to innovation and investment. So this is the second aspect, that the regulatory policies are heavy, late. They come in too late. They're not reactive enough, but they exist, and we are expecting a lot. I think at the end of 2020, the result of the work on that. And there's the national authorities that have a limited competency, and they do what they can. And the French authority, competition authority, is particularly efficient, I have to say, and it's recognized as such by the European Commission. With what they've developed, contrary to the World Trade Organization and Europe, is not to develop fines, a fining system. This is useless when considering the financial weight of the GAFAs. No, they forbid those players to play. So at a level of a territory like France and Europe, the international level, the global level is different. We need to develop at the European and French level a better reactivity of our institutions. Thank you, Georges Terrier. A few minutes of a debate. And then I will relay the questions that were asked by the people on the internet. So, Stéphane PALLEZ, you're the only person for highlighting the fact that what could be punished or fined was the fact of abusing a dominant position. The question that is addressed to you is, how do you regulate the power of monopolies? The fact of having monopolies is a problem as such, or should you be concerned only when this monopoly has such a powerful position that it can abuse of its position? And then clear, should you regulate the monopolies that are illegal, or should we consider that we have a real GAFA problem, even if they're not illegal, but they're corporations that are more powerful in the States? I think this gives rise to questions that could lead to the fact of breaking these monopolies. I know that when Sébastien SORIANO said we need to break them, people sort of like raised their eyebrows. That was very interesting by Soriano's comment. Sébastien Serrano's. Personally, I'm safe, so it's okay. So knowing that the theory of monopolies is it's a form that is evolving, changing, and what we need to avoid is that becomes a permanent monopoly that becomes overpowerful. And on that standpoint, okay, I understand very well what Sébastien Soriano said, but the problem with the GAFAs is that they are a level of overpower that is such that the question of breaking their monopoly is raised today, because since they weren't regulated before, it could be the only solution or the only credible threat to manage to change things. So in my opinion, dismantling is a serious option? No. Why do the Americans, why there are prosecutors in the U.S. that join forces to study this subject? It's because since there was no regulation in the past, then we end up with this situation, this context, a full monopoly. Normally the regulation should be there before. But it's the first thing to avoid having ending up with the situation where we're faced with. Should we dismantle them, for example? We know for many reasons, I'm not sure it can happen, because then it's an issue of power. It has to be an American choice, in fact. And it's complicated. It consists in looking in parallel to looking at different type of risks, different objectives, and for me, it's the job of the states and authorities.
Solution, c'est de dire.
So, Anne Perrault will tell us the ex-ante regulations. I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Sébastien Soriano, we didn't talk before this roundtable, this session number 18. Why do we just move to the GAFAs? We talk about monopolies and powerful companies, and without having discussed this, we all end up talking about the GAFAs. Is that where the problem is? Is that the only place where we have the problem? Isn't the problem the railroad system, the electricity supply, or gaming, for example? The problem is called, the name of the problem is Amazon, maybe IBM, maybe Apple, maybe what have you. There are many ways of addressing this issue. The topic of GAFAs is strong, but we should always wonder why. Why is this power strong? Why are we worried about it? Because we're at the heart of an extremely big change, digital change. So this book, The Great Transformation by PERONNET, which explains that how we can transforming the earth in a market, the enclosure phenomena, we've changed the functioning of society. What's happening, this information revolution is very important. So the information, the temperature of this studio, the mean color of the shirts of our auditors, you know, everything is becoming immersionized, so big data. And this changes things considerably. Creating new intermediaries, new powers. It's the information revolution. So this revolution, changing everything that we call the Uberization at one point, big data, artificial intelligence, and what have you. So it's always opening new doors. It's the information revolution, and it will continue for a long time, and that is the issue. And this leads to the fact that we are looking at the GAFAs with such attention. And there's another transition, ecological transition. We should ask ourselves what power certain actors have on pesticides and how these actors can slow down or accelerate the ecological transition. There was an interesting moment on the situation of Air France during the COVID when they decided to refinance Air France. The public authorities decided to stop some of the links for environmental considerations. And we see that in the two major transitions that are on the table, the digital and environment transformation, we could try to favor, encourage, or certain things of general interest, but there's a certain moment where you have enterprises that are pivotal, that structure. And there, we don't know how to operate. No, sorry, it's not my position. I'm saying we know how to do. We're capable. We don't have the courage of doing things the right way. In this transition, there are companies that are very strong, corporations that are very strong. We've developed a first interesting tool, which is the systemic banks kind of regulation that was developed after the 2008 crisis, where we figured that in the end, at the end of the day, in the world financial system, some actors have become strong to the point that we need to monitor their activities. In terms of liquidities, in terms of capital assets. I'm not a specialist of the environment. I will not address this topic, but in the digital transition, we're at a time where you have systemic actors in this transition. This transition is changing our lives, changing our relationship to democracy, to information, the way we communicate. And it's time to really concentrate on just a handful of enterprises and control them very, very strongly. So you all agree to say there is a GAFA issue problem. So at the stage of this discussion at PERROT, what do you have in mind to react on what you said? I'll ask Olivier PERONNET and Yifan Ding what they think about that on the Chinese-American relations.
Well, the two main pathways that we can see are, on the one hand, we would need a body to regulate systemic platforms. And the question is, who? And this should be a global one. Not French, barely European, but it should be global. And the question is, what type of regulations will be passed? Do we have, will it be forbidden? Forbidden if changes are not made or allowed. But in terms of platforms, it's much more difficult to write what is forbidden and what is not, because it's a really difficult task, because those platforms are so inclusive. Can we use the transport data of the web users to offer content that might interest them or to advertise them? Should we allow this? Should we ban this? So writing such a list would be very complicating. It would be a challenge. Maybe we could ask the platforms themselves, for example, when Google changes its algorithm, it knows that we know that there will be strong impacts on the ecosystem because they go through the bottleneck that Google is. So maybe he could go to a regulator and ask whether the algorithm can change. Now, the second point was that of dismantling the platforms. Of course, we can dream about that and believe that we will separate research from other functions that Google, Facebook, or Amazon offer. But how to cut such a digital engine? And I've never met anyone so far that could tell me it's easy. I think this is very difficult to implement. So dismantling might be something we can dream of, but I'm not sure it's an option. But more decentralized regulation, but under a new form. Olivier Perronnet, how does this resonate with history? Should we regulate monopolies through public choices and constraints, or should we fight them? Can we regulate or can we fight monopolies? And in your opinion, do you only think that the main point is environmental transition? In fact, I quite agree with what Sébastien Soriano said. Those globalized companies are the main point compared to historical monopolies because they can capture a global market. So the answer should be globalized. But there's good news because counterpowers in America are starting to wake up because GAFA are American companies. And people think about the economic wars and the difference between French condition and the American history that use competition as a form of regulation, and as well as their law devices. I think the answer should be globalized. But the good news is what is taking place in the Department of Justice, because American prosecutors followed suit. And I think it's interesting to see this exists and that American democracy is trying to create counterpowers. But who could be the regulator? We have a practical example that was born in the G20 with the fight against tax havens. And those are two different problems, that of the GAFAs and the tax havens, of course. But we managed to have a rule saying that the 20 most powerful countries in the world accepted to develop in the countries. And what the American regulator will say concerning monopolies, that is the GAFAs, will be interesting because I think that the rules, if we think on a global level, we might find new means to regulate them in terms of principles and limits. And then a third point, I think, and I want to say it again, Europe must be an economic player, and it's an emergency. And what Sébastien Soriano said, that is for competition to have the means to exist, because we are on the defensive. We're talking about regulation, but not competition in Europe. Olivier, I understand that we need a globalized answer, but how to regulate when the two main superpowers in the globe, well, it's relevant. Globalized regulation is necessary because we have geopolitical constraints. It's going to be very complex. Olivier Perronnet is right. Because the U.S. is the legal domain of the GAFAs because they are based in America. Then G20 can be a political framework. The European Commission also. But the experience of the WTO revealed geopolitical problems and the inability of global institutions to move forward. So WTO was created in 1995. There was an extension of regulation on intellectual and industrial property. So there was a wider view of the international market, but we are on a dead end for three parts. First, unanimity is difficult to reach. The fact that it's very difficult to have a univocal answer. If people look at one device, then there's interaction. People talk about fiscal or tax problems. And there are many parameters. And the rule at the WTO is to have a global agreement or no agreement. And if there's no global agreement, there's no agreement. And then finally, the conflicts, because the body that was supposed to arbitrate conflicts between states has been stuck because the United States and the American judges has not been replaced. So you're saying it would be a great answer, but there's no answer. I'm saying that we're stuck because of international politics. But if we have a governance such as Europe and with states that are used to working together, then we might find a solution. I think it is at the level of the European Union.
So, Yifan, how do you react on what we just said, notably on the position of the U.S. and the way they envisage the future and the great difficulty to find global answers to reestablish a little bit more balance in all this? Shensheng, Yifan.
Visiblement, la liaison avec Yifan n'est pas actuellement.
Unfortunately, we lost the connection with Mr. Yifan. He's there. He's there. Sorry. So for the monopoly and the regulation of monopoly is a natural commercial form of enterprises, because with this monopoly, if the market is monopolized by an enterprise, the enterprise can generate big profits. And so it's a natural trend of enterprise to develop to form monopolies. But it's detrimental to the consumer, because insofar as the enterprise takes advantage of them, they can, of course, increase their prices. And in this case, the state or the government, the public authorities should intervene to try to break this kind of monopoly. Okay. But on the market, there's always the fact that if a company has monopolized the market entirely, it can form a consortium. That's the problem with oligopolies. It's a kind of a monopoly of the market by a few industrialists who the oligopolies. Okay. And so in certain sectors of the economy, in public services, for example, or specific industries like nuclear plants, for example, in this sector, exacerbated competition would be detrimental to the profitability of the investment. And so in this case, in many countries, like in France, for example, you have formed natural monopolies in the public services and for electricity, for with their nuclear plants and everything. This is meaningful. It makes sense for today. It makes sense for today. But when you talk about the digital economy or of these groups like Google or the GAFAs, what have you. The idea is to find out if they are enterprise that are part of a kind of public service, or if they are enterprises that are naturally in the competitive sector. If they are in the competitive sector, then in this case you need to encourage competition. And so see that not one single company could monopolize the market like the global market. So you're in favor of more regulations, aren't you? Yes. When you don't, if you haven't distinguished the nature of this kind of service or identified the nature of this enterprise, it'll be difficult to rule over their activities. This is my own analysis. Okay. I don't know if we would ask the same questions today if Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple were European or French enterprises and not American. Okay, this is in line with what you said, Stéphane PALLEZ. There are elements that should be regulated, and Yifan said that too also. We talked about railroads, we talked about nuclear plants, utilities. And so we need to invent new systems with a view to the new context. So at this stage of our discussion, we have some paths, either play on the defensive, that is act using law, the authorities, whether they are national, international, whatever, or the more offensive position is competition. Competition, but the day where you can compete Google with Quant is not, we're not there yet. In general, you need both. You need the defensive position and offensive position. In any strategy, you have to have all the weapons, use all the weapons available. And that's how you can survive. I would like to go back. I think that Sébastien Soriol said clearly that the information revolution is really what started everything, triggered everything. And what is striking is when you talk about information, you think of BATX or GAFAs. So will the Europeans, have the Europeans lost this war, lost this battle? We never lose such battles, but we've lost the first game. But the natural conclusion is that we need a level. I think we shouldn't do any daydreaming, but we need a European level. We need to invent a new kind of regulations at the European level. It's exactly what Anne-Péro was saying. I'll take a concrete example today. Today, we have the RGPD application in France that will consist in forbidding cookies. I'm not a specialist of that, but what I'm told is that the main consequence is that it will yield a new advantage to the GAFAMs because they have proprietary systems and they will continue to store data, to collect data, leading to the point that they will have a growing power on the advertisement market, and they will increase their market shares on that. So maybe it's a non-topic, but what are the means we have to intelligence this, to study this intelligently, with all the competencies required, and it doesn't exist yet today. So that's a problem for me. And generally speaking, the regulator is always a little bit late. You will react, and then I have a question from Gerard that I will address to Sébastien SORIANO. And so in these attempts that seem to regulate, and they seem to be to yield an additional advantage for these leaders. So on what Stéphane PALLEZ said, I think that all the regulations potentially have pro and anti-competitive results, notably on cookies. With cookies, we don't want to go into technical details, but these regulations that seem to be protective for consumer data, ended up strengthening the power of the gatekeepers, those enterprises through which the whole digital world has to pass to have access to the internet user. So all these discussions will take place notably in the consultation of the EU European Commission in the e-privacy ruling to see how the data of consumers can be processed or used. But at the present time, we must say that the Commission is not naive. There are a lot of debates. We'll say a few words on that. A lot of debates organized by the European Commission, and on which through which the actors can express themselves. Gérard's asking Sébastien Soriano, counterintuitive question: why a strong control rather than favoring the birth of competition? The adding of regulations strengthen existing enterprises. The more you regulate them, the more you help them. In fact, I think you have to make a distinction behind this notion of regulation. There are two objectives that are quite different. The first objective is to break the monopoly. This is what we did with the telecoms. Remember, 20 years ago there was a monopoly in there, and now we have competition. The second objective is to cohabitate with the monopolies. And I agree with Stéphane PALLEZ. Breaking monopolies takes time. It takes time. For the telecom, it took 20 years. And during this transition, you have to cohabitate, live besides the monopolies. How do you live besides monopolies? So there are ways that are more or less intelligent. If you start ruling over having general regulations that applies to the whole of Internet, the fact that you will slow down, in fact, you'll slow down everybody, and mainly the smaller operators. The one size fits all is not a good idea. But the major operators will get the delegation from the smaller operators from the complexity of regulation. Since it's complicated to be RGBD compliant, well, they use the marketplaces, the GAFAs, which are RGBD compliant because they have an army of lawyers. So in all horizontal approaches, there's a risk of strengthening the bigger players, and that's the reason why I recommend that we have regulatory actions that are only for the bigger ones. No horizontal regulations. You take the bigger operators and really treat them. And you ask, why don't we force the bigger operators have a .fr instead of a .com? And that way you take and notably for tax reasons, .fr instead of .com. If you change the domain name, then you sort of like make him local. Well, China has the big wall, the internet. And it's the Chinese state decides what is on their own internet. In Cuba, it's even worse because they create the contents. So, I mean, okay. I think the choice we made in Europe is the neutrality of the internet, an open internet. Some people say that it goes too far, but it's true. I'd like to add something with a view to this question on a resolute action against monopolies. I feel that I'm a bit the opponent here today, but. There's the BUC, the group of European regulators, and they clarified their position with a view to the major actors of the net, and because it benefits to the consumer, because it's free. I can tell you that their answer is strong. They say, that's enough. We want to have the choice. We want to pull out of a false competition. And we don't not only want to have the benefit from the work of the regulatory authorities who apply fines, but we want, like the telecom, something that generates the rules for competition. The second, Monsieur Fasquelle and Mrs. Fournussian from the Republicans and Les Républicains En Marche, they prepared a very highly detailed report. And for the first time in the National Assembly in France, they clearly state that the Schumpeterian prophecy did not take place. The supremacy of the markets is worrisome.
Numérique.
So, we have to succeed where the competition law failed. You don't believe that the competition innovation will happen naturally. No, this is what the regulation we did for the telecom was used for. The monopoly did not break by itself. You needed an authority that accompanied this movement, and this is what we have to do against the big techs. I have a lot of auditors that ask us, Nathan, Brian, do you think that there is a political will So no, we don't know where that leads to. Rethink the doctrines of competition in Europe. You raised that, notably in the abuse of positioning. And I'm wondering if these investigations lead anywhere. You know, they're open, and we have to wait 6, 7, 8 years. You talk about their role that is criticized sometimes with the mergers and acquisitions, and so on and so forth. Is Europe on the right path, on the right track? Has it made any progress? Is it heading in the right direction in terms of the rewriting of its competition doctrines?
Well, we are well aware of those industrial movements, the role of the states, and we have a commission that works very professionally and that pays attention to economist thesis. But in terms of abuse of dominant position, there's an old doctrine, and we have competent services, but when you carry out a survey, it takes between 5 to 10 years, and that's a problem. So you can charge them with fines. Google had to pay 1.5 billion, but it doesn't bring about change in terms of behavior or mindset on the market concerning monopolies or their powers. So when we talk about abuse of dominant position, the Commission needs to be quicker and to reinvent measures that would be preemptive and conservatory. So meaning that if someone behaves illegally, you stop it immediately. And that would be fundamental, because if we have to wait for 5 to 10 years, it's not possible. Now, concerning the control of concentration, the question is different, because then the policy of the Commission should be more liberal. We should integrate elements such as duration, international competition, and not only European competition, that is, extend to the relevant market. I'm thinking of restructuration such as Alstom. So you take, you have a view of the consumer's interest in the long term with research and development. Okay, we have 8 minutes before the end of the debate. Many people are listening to us and reacting on the internet. People are wondering about tax policies. Some are mentioning dismantling. Some hope that competition might exist. So maybe we can have a last round with our speakers. Olivier PERRONNET. Do you think there are reasons to believe in these regulations? Or will we have counterproductive effects? Because if there is too much regulation, it might benefit the largest companies. Yes, the tools are defensive but necessary. I'm an optimistic at heart, so what was done at the G20 and the OECD with the fight against tax haven demonstrates that on a global scale, things can be changed, and principles also. The situation is different from tax havens, but it would be useful and interesting to see what the regulating authorities say in the USA and what principles they apply, so that we might capitalize on that. This is food for thought. Now, the taxation answer is defensive, because it's not only about Americans who have globalized groups. And the issue of taxation must be dealt with globally. So indeed, people are thinking about that with the OECD. And France took measures that seem relevant because the question is being asked. But the solution to the question seems very difficult, because globalized groups based in Europe might also review their taxation base. So it's a very complex solution. Simonetta says, and PERROT, okay, if we talk about an ex-ante regulation, it's going to be difficult, but many people react similarly. Maybe we would lag behind because you will be building laws where all these GAFAs are ahead of us. So the question is there a reason for hope? Is there a reason for hope, Stéphane PALLEZ? Will we find the right solution? Of course there is reason for hope. And this roundtable is proof. There is raising awareness on those subjects. And there is political support to do things. But the main issue is how to manage. But we can have very clever and adaptive regulators. Okay, we have 4 minutes. If ending, very short word because I must be exactly on time. That is 12:40 Paris time. Okay. I would like to add a few words about what you said. That is the Great Electronic Wall in China. But it is much more complex than what you say. China does not exclude all the services from those GAFA group. Amazon has a selling service in China, but other things are not allowed. We also have some services from Google, which are allowed, but the whole web is not allowed. Because there was negotiation because the Chinese government and Google, and China asked Google to respect several rules and standards, but they refused. So this great digital wall in China is part of what you call regulation somehow, market regulation. And we managed to we accepted some of the service provided by the American groups, but we excluded other services because those services might provoke danger for the Chinese government. Okay, thank you a lot in funding for being part of this session 18. I won't be able to have everyone speak. Sébastien Soriano, oh, just a word. Yes, it feels like regulation has become a problem and not a solution. Some mistakes were done horizontally, but we will never be wrong if we want to break monopolies. We can do it. We have tools to do it. We've been doing this for the last 20 years. It's a question of political willingness. And PERROT, maybe we can think about the strong ideas. Of course, we need competition, but the thing is that competition is not something that you can require so that it happens. To fight Microsoft monopolies, it took time. So hope means also not hampering innovation, so that maybe Google will disappear. I don't know about that. We never know. Maybe in 10 years' time, it won't be interesting any longer. And we mustn't be counterproductive when we regulate, because we could hamper innovation. And I agree with Sébastien. We need competition to stop the power of platforms. So we need competition. So asymmetrical regulation is what happened in the telecom field with some success. There were many players that wanted to enter the market, and regulation made it possible to open the door. There's also a right to competition. It is too slow. to be efficient in any circumstances. So we have to rethink governance and new regulation. Thank you all for this session number 18. Thank you for joining us, and we will keep having our rencontre until Sunday. Have a nice day.